Our next topic of the course is called the Jacksonian era. And as mentioned there in the subtitle, this is a period of political and economic revolutions that occur in the United States. Now, we just left behind the early national period, and as discussed in that period in our lecture, we talked about how there was this loosening of connections, not only with England, but also with Europe after the War of 1812. And what we're going to see here is a period of increasing nationalism, which, as we discussed, was already happening during the early national period, but we're going to see it even more. We're going to see the expansion of our national economy, U.S. capitalism, and we're going to see a form of approach to foreign affairs where basically, we prefer not to intervene in global affairs. That's going to be our foreign policy outlook. Okay, this is called isolationism. Okay, and we'll see that specifically with the Monroe Doctrine. Okay, now one thing to say off the bat here before we talk at length and in depth about the Jacksonian era is let's recall that republicanism, when we started with Jefferson, let's recall Jefferson's simplicity. Jefferson had this vision of the U.S., being kind of simple and agrarian based. Well, this is not what happens, right? Jeffersonian simplicity basically is left behind, and the nation becomes marked by complexity. And really, the culmination of this during the 19th century, at least, will be the Civil War that breaks out in the early 1860s, as well as our Industrial Revolution that'll occur. Technically, the Industrial Revolution in our country happens a little bit before the 1860s, but it'll definitely, blossom by the post-war era. Okay, meaning post 1865. Okay. Now, before we discuss the Jacksonian era, I should mention this: that the Jacksonian era technically begins with the election of Jackson, and he didn't get elected until 1828. So I just mentioned that the early national period, on the other hand, before the Jacksonian period, ended with the War of 1812. So what accounts for, let's say, that period between 1816, which is when the war ended, and 1828? Well, historians refer to this period as the era of good feelings. Okay, so this I just said 1816, right? You could easily say 1815 through 1828. Okay, that's what the slide here says, 1815. And one thing we're going to discuss with the era of good feelings is it's marked by increasing nationalism. All right. So, by the way, why do they call it the era of good feelings? Well, let's remember that the country survived this trial period. As I kept mentioning previously, no one knew for certain that the Constitution was going to work. No one knew that the Republic was going to survive in, let's say, 1800, right? When they began to operationalize the Constitution, put it in effect, in other words. So I would say that by the end of the war with England, right, the War of 1812, well, we became more self-assured. We became confident that this republic will survive, and who knows, might even become a great country, right? Okay, so that's why they call it the era of good feelings. It was actually coined by a journalist who was watching the president during this period after the War of 1812, basically making a tour of the country. And, people were in the streets during parades and were feeling very proud of their country, the United States, very patriotic. And that journalist said, "This is the era of good feelings." Okay, so the name stuck. All right, so again, it marks between 1815, or it is marked between 1815 and 1828. 1828 again is the election of Jackson, Andrew Jackson. So this is sandwiched in between the early national period and the Jacksonian period. So the theme here, as seen in the slide, when we discuss the era of good feelings, is increasing nationalism. Okay, so we're going to look at three things here that's mentioned in the slide: the American system, a court case called McCullough versus Maryland, and an example of American foreign policy, which I just described as isolationism. We're going to see that with the Monroe Doctrine in 1824. And again, keep in mind that when I discuss all three things, I'm talking about nationalism. Okay, so first let's engage with the American system. Okay, and notice it's called the American system, right? America, the nation. So you can easily link that to increasing nationalism, right? Okay, so here's the deal with the American system. This is really a form of economic nationalism. That's something we discussed with the war hawks, right? If you recall, where they wanted to be self-sufficient rather than be beholden economically to England. So right after the War of 1812, we see the attempt to undertake this economic independency, right, to pursue it. And a big part of this goal was called the American system. And the goal here was to connect the country economically, right? And therefore to promote economic self-sufficiency. You got to remember that something I mentioned a while back, that there was really no definite national economy at the time. You know, you had all these states, you had their separate economies. Even when you look at infrastructure, which is a big part of the American system, by the way, the building of infrastructure. But before the American system, you didn't see an infrastructure of, let's say, roads, you know, ways to connect the country through roads and eventual, highways, for lack of a better term, right? Um, well, this is what's going to be undertaken with the American system. It should be mentioned that in terms of economics, right, it was very difficult to ship something, to use that term today that we use, ship, right? It was very difficult to ship um, commodities going west because of this lack of roads and infrastructure. All right. In fact, it was cheaper to ship something to England than it was to go, let's say, a few hundred miles going west on the North American continent, right? And that's not good if you want to build your economic system, right? That's national again. So again, let's think about increasing nationalism, the theme of Year of Good Feelings. Think about economic nationalism. And the goal here is to connect economically the nation, right? Hence economic nationalism. Now, this was done through a myriad of ways. I'm sorry, I fast forwarded here, but here you have an example of what's called the transportation revolution, where, before, let's say, the War of 1812, you didn't see all these arteries going throughout the east, going north to south, but definitely going east to west. You didn't see that, okay? So the project with the American system was to build turnpike state canals, which is more up here, right, in upstate New York, steamboats there in the canals, and eventual railroads. Okay, so that's what's going to be undertaken here, and this amounts to what historians call the transportation revolution. Now, railroads, I should mention, that gets invented in the 1830s, and you won't have a transcontinental or intercontinental railroad until 1869, after the Civil War. So don't get the idea that you have, railroads connecting the east to west, right? But eventually, at the end of the transportation revolution, you will. Okay, so the next area of nationalism here is connected to the McCullough versus Maryland Supreme Court case. Okay. And again, this is linked to economic nationalism. So, what is this court case about? Well, basically, it was this case where there was the creation of another national bank. Let's remember that Hamilton, during the early national period that we discussed, created the first national bank of the United States, right? And he justified it based on implied powers. But then that bank collapsed in 1811, and because after the War of 1812, because of the felt need to economically expand, let's say to finance that transportation revolution we alluded to, well, there was this felt need to create a national bank, the second national bank. Now, this became a Supreme Court case because the state of Maryland, um, which was not in favor of this, threatened to tax, right, the national bank. All right. And this went all the way to the Supreme Court. But what really is important about the McCullough versus Maryland case is much less about, taxation and the second national bank. Okay. What's really important about the McCullough versus Maryland case is that the Supreme Court rules that what we call the implied powers doctrine, that's connected to the elastic clause. Let's remember that, right? Necessary and proper clause, which basically gives the federal government this wide ranging authority should it be justified as a means to realize an end or a goal, right? And that's what we call the implied powers. It delegates the national government with unprecedented authority, right? And let's keep thinking about the American Revolution. This is what the founders feared, ironically, right? But the Supreme Court favored for implied powers to basically eclipse or to supersede that of any argument based on constructionism. Okay, you have to go back to Jefferson and Hamilton and recall the argument between constructionism versus implied powers, right? And the Supreme Court is basically saying this: in all cases in the future, implied powers, the doctrine of implied powers, will trump that of constructionism. Okay, so in other words, you can't contest certain regulations or taxation based on constructionism from this point forward, says the Supreme Court. Okay, implied powers has precedence. Okay, so that is very important for what? Economic nationalism. It gives the federal government more authority, right? More power to realize the goal of, again, economic nationalism. So that's how it's linked to economic nationalism. Okay. Now, the third thing here is the Monroe Doctrine of 1824. And some of you may have heard about this in previous history classes. But what is this? This is basically the establishment of the American policy of isolationism. Okay. And what is isolationism? Isolationism refers to a foreign policy attitude and approach whereby a country um, chooses not to intervene in global affairs. Rather, they focus inward, if you will. They focus on domestic affairs. So, in other words, you don't want to get entangled in all these foreign affairs like wars abroad or alliances with other empires back then. No, you just want to focus on your own country, right? The development of your own country. So that's isolationism. And this is what the Monroe Doctrine basically exclaims in 1824. Because Europe at this time was threatening to send over its navies to put down some, flare-ups of revolution in Latin America. Okay, Spain was an empire, as you probably know, but they were already starting to collapse.